Hello and welcome to the video version of Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar and located at warscholar.org. We talk about military history from ancient to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez and thank you for watching. I'm speaking with Bryan Gibby, author of Korean Showdown, National Policy and Military Strategy in a Limited War, 1951 to 1952. Published by University of Alabama Press, January 12, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation.
So first, how did you get started or how did you end up writing a book on this subject?
Well, I'm a serving active duty Army officer, and that is what has really brought me into the field of military history. And although serving on active duty, all of my academic work has been on my own time and resources. So all the opinions that I express are mine and do not reflect those of the United States government. I was commissioned as a military intelligence officer in the early 90s. And I was very interested in the German army of World War II, armored warfare, and the conflict with the Soviet Union. But I ended up getting posted to Korea, much to my surprise, in the very late 90s to 2000. And although I knew a little bit about the Korean War, principally what most Americans know, it gets sandwiched between World War II, which had unconditional surrender and apparently total victory, and Vietnam, which had a very unsatisfactory ending and was very controversial at home, and really brought a lot of problems for the United States Army. So Korea gets sandwiched in between these two conflicts, and that's why it carries the nickname of the Forgotten War. Because most Americans either don't know what it was about, why it was fought, and why it ended, or how it ended. So my service in Korea really opened my eyes to kind of this historical problem. And when I went to graduate school, I did my work principally about the American military advisors to the South Korean Army. And that resulted in my first book called The Will to Win, American Military Advisors in Korea. And in the process of looking at how the Americans trained and organized the Korean Army, I came upon this battle that takes place in October 1952. And it's an American-led operation. It's called Operation Showdown. And that's where the title of this book comes from, Korean Showdown. And it was the last deliberate offensive effort undertaken by the Americans in the Korean War in an attempt to try and solve the stalemate that had developed by October 1952. So I'd kind of put this in the back of my rucksack because I wasn't ready to really develop it yet. And then about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to start digging into this. And what I learned was really quite interesting, that the battle itself was in response to a Chinese offensive that had started in September of 1952. And that offensive was in response to the Americans cutting off the negotiations at the end of September of 1952 because of the conflict over the resolution of prisoners of war. And that came about because of a decision that President Harry Truman made in February of 1952, that the United States would not accept an armistice agreement that required the compulsory or forced repatriation of prisoners of war. So I saw that there was this long chain of causation between this particular battle that practically nobody knows anything about, which by the way does not end very successfully for the Americans, which is one of the reasons why President Eisenhower, when he takes office in January of '53, is willing to settle the Korean War substantially under the objectives that had been articulated by President Truman. So I saw that there was this linkage between a policy decision made in Washington that was not popular with soldiers because it promised to extend the war potentially indefinitely, and was very frustrating for the field commanders who now had to fight the war to get the Chinese to agree to a condition that was ideologically antithetical to their very existence. The idea that an individual could exercise choice to where they wanted to live.
Right.
And it was about 2/3 of the Chinese prisoners of war had indicated that they did not want to go back to communist China. So this was a big deal for the Chinese. So American commanders had to apply enough pressure to make the Chinese give in, but at the same time, not so much pressure that it makes it look like the Chinese have lost. So they have to kind of split this fine line, and this produces these operations and tactics at the ground level that are really very hazardous to the individual soldier. And when I look through the resources of officers and men who fought in this particular battle, Operation Showdown, one of the things that they testify to is what they perceived as kind of the futility of why are we conducting this attack against a very strong enemy, deeply entrenched, when the war is supposed to be at a stalemate and we're supposed to have an armistice and go home. It didn't quite compute. And so this book is really analyzing the struggle that principally the Americans, although I do talk about the Chinese and the Koreans to some degree, at the strategic level, how do they fix this problem between policy, which is asking for something that's very hard to deliver, and then the tactics on the ground of the soldiers who actually have to put it into play.
It sounds like the civilian government, the U.S. government, sort of had faith that the U.S. military, for some whatever they were thinking, it seemed that they were expecting success, military success, and and thus put pressure on China and North Korea, to give in. What was there? Were they just hoping, or was there something concrete where they actually felt they could succeed with this operation?
Yeah. So for President Truman is in a very difficult situation from the very beginning of the conflict, because the Korean War is not a declared war. Congress never said, we are at war with Korea. So the intervention is really at Truman's political liability. He's assuming all the political risk to take the country to war, and he's doing it under the umbrella of the United Nations. So the United States is the executive agent for the United Nations Security Council, which includes Communist Russia, by the way, to force the North Koreans out of South Korea to start with, which we did, and it was very successful. The Incheon operation that General Douglas MacArthur launched clears South Korea substantially of North Korean soldiers. But now Truman is faced with, well, what do we do now? Because under the World War II model, there should be a surrender, and the North Koreans should give up, but they don't. So MacArthur is given permission after some a little bit of back and forth. He's given permission to proceed north of the 38th parallel, which was the pre-war boundary, an imaginary boundary, and then it becomes a problem of the Americans trying to figure out when do we know we've won? When can we say we have been successful? So this bleeds into then the Chinese intervention and discussion about maybe we should just leave Korea, evacuate Korea, because the real conflict is with the Soviets, and we think the real war is going to be in Europe. So why would we invest so much liability in East Asia if that's not really the main theater? But thanks to General Matthew Ridgway, who becomes the 8th Army commander after General Walton Walker dies in a vehicle accident, Ridgway's ability to kind of reanimate the American Army and the UN allies, to kind of reassure them as well that he's not going to march all the way to China, really turns the military situation around. So I think the president kind of sees that, we were really in trouble in December and January, and now with my guy Ridgway in charge, it's looking a lot better. And the 8th Army and the United Nations allies were moving forward, and we're even crossing the 38th parallel again by June. In between this, in April of 1951 is when General MacArthur gets relieved for insubordination. And President Truman, not surprisingly, elevates General Ridgway to take MacArthur's place. So now Truman thinks, okay, I got my guy who can fight and will fight in a way that won't start World War III, and he's running the show. He's in command of all the United Nations contingents. He's in command of the South Korean Army and the American Air Force, Army, and Naval forces in Korea. And this perhaps gives Truman a false sense of what can be accomplished because of this really miraculous turnaround. And in June of 1951 is when the Soviets indicate their willingness to support a negotiated settlement. And the president embraces that and gives Ridgway the mission, get us an honorable armistice. And so I think it's, from that point, that's kind of where the two now kind of diverge, is that there's this political sense of what we need to do to get an armistice so we can get out of Korea and get ready for the real war against the Soviets. And General Ridgway, who is handicapped because he can only talk about military issues. But like I said before, you can't put so much pressure on the enemy that it makes them want to fight harder because they don't want to look like they lost. So when it comes to the prisoners of war issue, I think the president, he's investing a lot of faith in Ridgway, that Ridgway can pull it off. But Ridgway is honest and says, I don't think we can do it with the resources that you've given me.
I'm speaking with Brian Gibby, author of Korean Showdown. You can find more information about his work at the University of Alabama Press website. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. Please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the video. So this is kind of a wonky question. So it sounds like Truman didn't have his people actually analyze what an operation would look like, the strengths and weaknesses and where are you going to attack and what success are you going to have. It seems more like he saw it in very fluffy terms, like, oh, these things were going poorly before and now they're better, so my cards look good to me, without really analyzing really what had changed.
President Truman was a captain in World War I and commanded an artillery battery in that war. He was a National Guard officer. And that experience of being a non-professional, non-regular soldier, I think kind of conditioned him a little bit to be suspicious about regular military officers and in particular generals. So it's interesting that when the North Koreans invade South Korea, President Truman's his first efforts at trying to figure out what should we do is not to consult the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his 4-star generals and admirals. It's to consult his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who civilian all the way and doesn't have any military experience, but is very intelligent and kind of sees the bigger picture pretty well and advises the president, I think, pretty well for someone who doesn't have that military angle. And the president tended to kind of hold those military officers kind of at arm's length. And it was really Dean Acheson that through him that he developed what was going to be American policy and kind of the American strategy, that then the Joint Chiefs would turn into operational language and transmit those instructions to first MacArthur and then Ridgway and then finally General Mark Clark. So yeah, Truman's thoughts are really at that higher level of policy and what I want to have done. And one of the things that he wanted to have done is he wanted to make sure that aggression came with a price tag. So he's very mindful of the Munich Compromise of 1938 and how many people thought that encouraged Adolf Hitler to kind of keep rolling the dice. And he very much saw the North Korean invasion as being a Soviet-inspired attempt to take over world domination. So he wanted aggression to have a penalty. And since that penalty was not going to be military defeat, that was going to be too hard to achieve with the communist Chinese in the war. I think he saw prisoner repatriation as being kind of that ideological tool that I can poke the communists in the eye and make it look like we actually did win something.
It's interesting because, and I don't want to turn this into any kind of Truman bashing, but another historian I talked to about the use of the atomic bomb mentioned that Harry S. Truman was, as a vice presidential candidate, he was brought on. FDR had another candidate in mind, but Truman was brought on because he was basically a non-threatening vice president to everyone involved.
Yeah.
He was kind of, non-consequential in a sense. And so he allowed FDR to win re-election again because no one on either political side, objected to Truman. And then he ends up becoming president.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting that you say that intellectually, he didn't like the military wonks, and instead he turns towards a diplomat, basically, to make this military decisions.
Yeah, I think the one exception to that generalization is General George Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
Truman had tremendous respect for Marshall, and they worked very closely together to end the war. But then Marshall retires and becomes a civilian. After Marshall goes to China and he's there for about a year and a half, but he returns, becomes a civilian, and becomes Truman's Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And then Atchison follows after Marshall. So by the time you get to 1950, to Korea, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is Omar Bradley, who is very famous, is justly famous for what he did in the Second World War, but he's not a Truman man. Bradley got his 4 stars working for President Roosevelt in the Second World War, and so I think Truman just didn't develop that kind of relationship with his senior military people the way Roosevelt had really cultivated relationships with Marshall and Admiral King during the Second World
War. Mm-hmm. So let's go a little bit into the weeds of the actual operation. You mentioned that the soldiers participating in it, some of them at least, were unhappy with it. And it's, you think about World War II just a few years before, you would never imagine soldiers saying, why are we fighting this? Because they were out to destroy Nazi Germany,
right,
or, Imperial Japan. And yet now we have soldiers who are like, what are we here for? What are we doing? That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. So, 2 problems for the American GI in 1950. A lot of them, particularly in the officer ranks, are recalled reservists. So these are people who fought the big one. Mm-hmm. They fought World War II. They came off active duty. They maintained their commission, or if they were sergeants, their NCR rank as reservists. And they believed that they would be ready to be called up for the big one, for World War III, to go fight the Soviets. And this included, Air Force pilots and Navy personnel. And instead, they get called up to go to the Far East, to Korea, where, what's in Korea? We don't know. We just know it rhymes with gonorrhea, and you want to avoid both of those. So there was very little enthusiasm on the part of these reservists who were being called up to then go fight this, not World War III war, which of course is what Truman wants. Truman does not want to fight World War III. So there's a disparity there. And then you get to what many historians call the stalemate phase, when the negotiations begin in June or July of 1951. And there was this expectation that 6 weeks, 8 weeks, we'll have it wrapped up, and then we'll be going home. Of course, that's 6 weeks, 8 weeks turns into 24 months, which was something that nobody really expected. But you get into the fall of 1951, and there's a sense of, on the part of the GI, that private, that corporal who'd been drafted, not to go fight the Soviets, but to go fight this war in Korea. Why should I be the last man to die in a war that's going to be settled by a ceasefire? Mm-hmm. And so there becomes this great reluctance to really, go all out and give it your all if, I capture this hill and then we're going to give it back, because by the terms of the armistice, the demarcation line's already been made. And so why am I willing to risk my life to attack ground that I'm going to have to give back to the enemy at the end of the day? Mm-hmm. And so this compounds then with the Army overall, worldwide, has a manpower shortage, because while we're fighting in Korea, we're also rearming to fight in Europe. And it's actually about a 60-40 split. 40% of troops mobilized go to Korea, 60% go to Europe. So Korea is constantly on this kind of the short end of manpower. So the Army and the Far East Command that Ridgway is now in charge of decides to do a rotation, where a soldier who earns 36 points will rotate out of theater and go home, basically. And you earn points by your proximity to the fighting. So if you're at the infantry battalion, company, or platoon, you're earning 4 points a month. So in 9 months, you're ready to leave. So imagine that infantry soldier who's been in country for 8 months and 25 days. And now he's being told, you're going to go attack that Chinese defensive position. Like, no. I mean, I'll act like I am. I'll give it a good college try, but not really. Mm-hmm. And this idea also infects, the officers, the lieutenants and the captains and the majors. They don't want to send a man forward in a risky operation who's supposed to go home in the next couple of days. General James Van Fleet, who takes over for Ridgway as the 8th Army commander, recognizes what this is doing to the 8th Army, that had been a very tightly strung, a very competent, probably the most competent field army that the United States had put to war up until that time, is now losing that combat edge because of these policies. Where if a soldier lasts 9 months in combat, he's probably picked up a lot of tricks of the trade. Mm-hmm. And it would be very useful to promote that soldier, and use him to train others. But nope, he's gone. He's going back to the United States. He's going to demobilize, and he's out. So by the fall of 1952, Van Fleet literally has an army that has, turned over 2 or 3 times. And he has a lot of lieutenants who are commanding companies, and usually a captain commands a company. He's got majors who are commanding battalions, and usually a lieutenant colonel commands a battalion. And on occasion, there's a lieutenant colonel commanding a regiment, where a colonel would normally do that. So you're also experiencing just a decrease in experience and judgment at increasingly higher levels. All of this combines to a less aggressive army, a less competent army, and an army that's going to take more casualties conducting riskier missions at the very time where you're trying to minimize casualties. And so yet another dichotomy that really kind of puts a bitter taste in the mouth of the veterans who are fighting this war in late 52 and early 53.
And were the Chinese and North Koreans, were they having these same kind of morale issues, or was it more a fight for, the homeland kind of thing?
Yeah, really, really good question. Unfortunately, North Korea really is kind of a closed book to Western scholars. We don't know a whole lot of what animated them, other than pretty universally American officers and soldiers who say, if you have to fight the Chinese or the North Koreans, better to fight the Chinese. The Chinese will actually surrender if the situation's hopeless. The North Koreans will fight to the death. So I would say, the North Koreans were ideologically very committed. A lot of them had extensive combat experience, either as partisans, as guerrillas. A lot of them fought in the Chinese Civil War on the side of the communists, which is one of the reasons why the North Koreans did so well early in the war against the South Korean army and the initial American intervention. These guys were committed and they were good. They were competent. Very reluctant to surrender. And after 1950, the North Koreans are really not. They are not in an offensive posture. The North Koreans are fighting defensively, which tactically is a much simpler problem, and they fight very well. The Chinese, on the other hand, it's kind of a mixed bag, because Mao Zedong is he's relying on his veterans from the Civil War, but at the same time he doesn't want to lose all his veterans of the Civil War, so he actually commits several divisions full of former Chinese nationalist soldiers who had fought against the communists. But at some point in that conflict, they had switched sides and everything was good. These soldiers, in the main, are the ones who end up surrendering to the Americans much more quickly, and then are the ones who are refusing to be repatriated. So by the time you get to the stalemate period, the Chinese recognize that this is a weakness for them. And they undergo a very significant strategic and tactical revolution to be able to fight the Americans on a more even plane in terms of firepower. They get a lot of artillery. They even get some tanks. They don't use their tanks as tanks. They use them mostly as kind of mobile artillery, but other weaponry from the Soviets, to include aircraft. And they changed their doctrine to how they were going to fight. Instead of this kind of guerrilla, this very fluid guerrilla attack the flanks and infiltration, which they realize is really dangerous if your enemy, is alert and has greater mobility than you, to this tactic that's called nuipitang, which I'm probably mispronouncing for anyone who knows Chinese. But nuipitang is a candy from the Hunan province where Mao is from. It's very sticky and it's very tough. And so to eat this candy, you just got to chew and chew and chew and chew and bite and swallow. And so the Chinese invent these tactics that are this, we're just going to chew and chew and chew and chew on these American positions until we can swallow them, and then we'll move on. And once the Chinese become more proficient and they get more artillery, this turns every battle with the Chinese into a more problematic situation. And this is what the Americans run into in October 1952, attacking Chinese fortifications. And the Chinese have spent a lot of time digging, boring through the living rock, miles and miles of tunnels, to protect them from the bombs and the artillery and the rockets. And they would use these tunnels, they would hide in these tunnels by day. And the Americans would show up and radio back, okay, we've secured the objective. And then at night, the Chinese would come out of these tunnels, and all of a sudden the Americans are in this knife fight, at 5 feet, 15 feet, and with all these Chinese, like, who are these guys? Where do they come from? And then the Chinese would then retreat back into these tunnels. And they call this the seesaw battle, just going back and forth. And they would just do this constantly. And the Chinese had the manpower to do that. The Americans don't. So we're trying to reduce casualties. We're trying to economize the lives of our soldiers, and we just can't engage in this attritional struggle at the tactical level.
I'm speaking with Bryan Gibby, author of Korean Showdown. You can find more information about his work at the University of Alabama Press website. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. Please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the video. So I was going to ask about the air war. It sounds like air power would not be very effective in this kind of operation or these kind of battles.
Yeah, and this is complicated by the disparity or the inability of airmen and soldiers to look at the battlefield in the same way. And this goes all the way back to World War II, when the Air Force is the United States Army Air Corps, and then the United States Army Air Forces. So you have soldiers on the ground and soldiers in the air, and they just don't see the war even in the same terms. And then once the Air Force becomes an independent service in 1947, and they get their own 4-star general on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they become really parochial in that the Air Force wants to fight their war. And it's very interesting that MacArthur's first commander, a guy named George Stratemeyer, who had extensive experience in China and India and Burma in that theater in World War II, his memoirs are called they're called The Three Wars of George Stratemeyer. And the three wars, you're thinking, okay, World War I, World War II, Korea. No, the three wars are against the bureaucrats in Washington, against the Marine Corps, and against the Army. Hmm. I'm being a little bit unfair, in that, but that's always in the back of the mind of the airmen is the Army going to take over our stuff? And if they're not, and if we can resist the Army taking over our stuff, are we going to have to perform missions for the Army, close air support principally, which is not very fun and is downright dangerous for a pilot flying a $500,000 aircraft to drive himself, into the guns of the enemy with the hope that his bomb is going to destroy the tank or the mortar or the fighting position. What the Air Force really wants to do is what they did in World War II with strategic bombing. And they want to use that as the principal strategy to defeat the North Koreans and end the war. The problem is between July and August, the strategic bombing forces destroy every target that there is. There's nothing left to bomb after September 1950. And the North Koreans haven't given up. And then when the Chinese enter the war, well, you can't bomb Manchuria and you can't bomb the Soviet Union. And that's where all the stuff's getting made. So, this idea that we're going to use strategic bombing to win falls flat pretty quickly. So you get to mid-1951 and the airmen say, aha, we got it. We're going to do battlefield interdiction. So there's close air support, which is, we're going to attack targets that are in contact with our own forces. And then there's strategic bombing is we're going to bomb stuff that's way in the rear. Battlefield interdiction is that middle place where the Army is not going to tell us what to do because it's too far away. We can fight our own war. and it's going to be all in Korea, so we don't have to worry about violating, Chinese airspace or the Soviets. And the idea is by bombing bridges, railroads, and roadways and trucks, we can starve the communist armies. And if we do it right, we can starve them so badly that they'll just give up because they can't sustain their forces in the field. Those airmen who kind of had the most optimistic view, that was their position. More realistic views were we can prevent the communists from building up enough supplies to prevent them from launching another offensive. Which is guys like Ridgway is like, okay, that's good. That if we can keep the enemy from attacking us, that's nice. So the Air Force for the next 2 years, they prosecute 4 different interdiction campaigns, which gives you a sense of how successful they are. They have to do 4 of them. And at one point, Ridgway is kind of sarcastic, says, well, it looks like you've destroyed every truck in Asia, but the communists are still shooting artillery shells at us. What's going on? Ridgway's kind of in a bind because once negotiations start, he can't authorize these massive ground offensives. So the only tool that he really has is air power. And they God bless them. They do the very best they can. There is no way you can fault their courage or their endurance to really tackle some very tough missions. There's one incident that I recount in the book of trying to attack what they called the rubber bridge, because it's this bridge over the Yalu River. Just seemed every time you hit it, it just would not fall. So the airman said it must be made of rubber because it just won't go down. And then there's a couple of incidents that are really quite tragic because the Air Force, it just doesn't, the technology's not there. They can't fly at night in the way that we can fly at night today. They try to, and in fact, General Van Fleet, who's the 8th Army commander, his son is killed on his very first night interdiction mission. We're not sure what happened to him, but we think that he drove his plane into a mountain. That seems to be the only thing that we can really piece together. So the technology is not there. You just can't drop enough bombs, conventional bombs. You can't drop enough conventional bombs to completely destroy a roadway or to completely destroy railroad. You got to go after it day after day, and you have to have constant coverage, which you just can't do. You burn out your so that's what the Air Force is up against. But like I said, they give it their best shot, and there's no lack of imagination to try to use air power as this coercive tool, because you can't use ground power. And it's not till mid '52 that the Air Force pretty much recognizes, hey, you know what, we kind of sold the Army a bill of goods that interdiction was going to be the silver bullet, and it's not. So let's just admit that it's not going to work, and let's go do what we want to do anyway, which is blow up, really cool stuff that's going to increase the pain on the communists. And at this point, General Mark Clark is the commander of the Far East Command. So he took Ridgway's place. He's in Tokyo. And he approves an operation at the end of June that will attack and destroy 5 hydroelectric dam facilities in northern Korea and along the Yalu River. That these have been off limits for a long time because of the risk of American planes going into China or blowing up dams. Those are civilian infrastructure. It wouldn't look good. But by the summer of 1952, we're kind of getting a little frustrated. So General Clark is willing to take the gloves off, and they launched this assault, which is one historian calls it the most spectacular airstrike of the war. We destroy all 5 of these hydroelectric facilities, and it basically turns the lights off in Manchuria. And brings industrial, what little industry is still operating in North Korea just grinds to a halt because they don't have any electricity. They have no power. So the airmen are like, yeah, this is what we're supposed to be doing, really putting the pain to the communists. Unfortunately, politically, it's a disaster. The British are very upset that we took this measure without consulting with them, which points to one of the problems of fighting in a coalition. Is just because you're the strongest member of the coalition doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. You have to take into account your allies, because the British are on the Security Council. They're in the UN. They have just as much clout as the Americans do. They're upset. The French are upset. Some of our Asian allies are a little bit dismayed. Like, you're supposed to be negotiating peace, and here you are wiping out this very valuable civilian infrastructure. And by the way, you really embarrassed the Chinese. And so if you think the Chinese are going to agree to your conditions after they've been so embarrassed, that's not going to happen. So it's kind of like, okay, we got to go back to the drawing board, because although it was, from a military standpoint, very effective, politically and strategically, it really didn't do much.
Should I even ask what the Navy contributed to what you discuss in the book?
Sure.
The operation.
Sure. So I don't deal with the Navy very much, but you do need to acknowledge their contribution. That the naval forces control the oceans, and Korea is a peninsula, and so if you can control the oceans, you've got a lot of flexibility to do stuff. We're never worried about running out of supplies. We're always going to get the food, the ammunition, the manpower that we need, because we control the waters. The Navy also contributes pretty significant air power as well. The problem from 1950 to 1951 is the Navy, they want to fight their war. So they agree to this interdiction plan, but they tell the Air Force, don't, we'll do our own interdiction. And for the airmen, this is heresy. Air power is supposed to be indivisible, meaning it needs to be centralized. It needs to be applied to a very strategic object. And if the Navy is doing its own thing, and even worse, the Marine Corps, this is not going to work. But in the operation that I talked about in June 1952, the attack on the hydroelectric dams, the Navy had agreed in the spring of 52 to join what they were calling the JOC, the JOC, the Joint Operations Center, which allowed the airmen now to kind of have this centralized control, and the Navy was gonna play ball with this joint center. So the Navy, and it's a good thing they were there, because the Navy knows how to bring very heavy bombs in low against a target that's up against water, which is what a dam is. And so the Navy brings in their A-1 Sky Raiders. They can carry a tremendous amount of bombs and rockets, and they really just hammer those dams. So you could say without the naval contribution, the strike probably would not have been as effective, because the Air Force would have been trying to destroy the dam from above. Very hard target to hit, but if you're coming at it, from the side, much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, it seems, with the Navy, it's like their success is so complete, in a sense, that it's like they're taken for granted, and they're almost invisible. But like you say, that there was no question about them controlling the waters,
Right.
And so no one talks about it. Like, okay, they got that.
Yeah, and there's not going to be any Chinese Navy, and the Air Force is kind of the same way. Very, very, very few American soldiers die because of enemy air attack. There's a couple, okay, but in the main, American soldiers are not worried about being attacked from above, which is a huge advantage.
Well, let me turn to the resources you used for your research. Can you touch on that? What archives you used?
Sure. So any research that is going to involve the American military, you got to go to the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, and they have all of the official reports, operations orders, after action reviews, any official documents, letters, between general officers. Which, by the way, as a historian, I don't know what they're going to do 100 years from now when everything's done over email and PowerPoint. The sources just aren't going to be there. But there's rich materials to be found, especially like for Showdown, the correspondence between Mark Clark, who writes a letter to Van Fleet basically saying, hey, what's the deal? How come we haven't won, and why have you suffered so many casualties? And then Van Fleet, in writing, has to justify what's going on, and that back and forth is very illuminating. So the National Archives and Records has all those official documents, to include the policy from the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, those kinds of records. And that gives you a very good broad outline. But to get down to kind of the granularity of the generals and the airmen themselves, you got to be a little bit more inquisitive. And so for the Army, you can go to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Army Heritage and Education Center, where many officers and soldiers have deposited their personal papers, which sometimes are actually official correspondence, which is very useful. But many times it's letters home, for example, can be found there. So General William Harrison, who is the chief negotiator for the United Nations Command for the Americans in July, August, September 1952, is writing to his family, to his children, and telling them basically, what a bunch of scumbags the communists are. And he's very eloquent and uses really good language that communicates his frustrations very well. And so you kind of get the sense of, all right, if it was this bad for him, trying to negotiate with his opposite numbers, how does that translate to General Van Fleet, to General Clark, and then back to Washington? And then there's other like memoirs, unpublished memoirs, and other materials, oral histories that are deposited at the Army Heritage and Education Center. The Air Force has a similar repository at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, which I found to be not as useful because it's not as well organized, especially for the Korean War period. I guess they just haven't had a lot of scholars trying to dig into those materials. But that archive did have digitized several of the studies that were published either while the war was going on or after the war that are very similar to kind of a RAND, analytical reports. And so I was able to kind of get this semi-official narrative about how the Air Force was fighting. For General Clark, he deposited his papers at the Citadel Archives and Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's a really good repository, not only for his materials, but for the United Nations Command. Because there's no United Nations Command archive, right? If you want to see United Nations Command materials, you got to go to Korea to be able to do that. But Mark Clark was the president of the Citadel up until he died, I think, in the early 80s. And so he left all of his materials there. And then there's some other officers associated with him, like General Michael O'Daniel, also known as Iron Mike, deposited his papers there. And he was one of the Corps commanders during this period of time. Other places that that I looked at here at West Point in their special collections archives, they had some materials. Presidential archives, Harry S. Truman in Independence, Missouri, and Dwight Eisenhower in Abilene, Kansas, also had materials. Fortunately, the things that I wanted to look at were digitized or online, and so that was really useful. And then the last place that you can find good sources is at the Center of Military History, which is in Washington D.C. They don't keep records per se, but they do keep historical reports and kind of resumes of various operations that official historians were charged with writing either at the time that they occurred. For example, in the documentation I used to talk about Heartbreak Ridge is derived substantially from a report that was written very soon after the battle. Or a couple years later, they kind of look at, what were some of the problems the Army had? Let's get a couple historians to look into that.
What was the most surprising thing you came across in your research?
Operation Eveready, which was a plan for the United States Army to take over the government of South Korea.
That's how deeply did they get into planning for that?
So the story behind this is when the Republic of Korea was founded in 1948, Syngman Rhee was elected president. And Syngman Rhee is he's a very valuable character in Korean history. He basically looked at himself as a combination of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in terms of what he meant to his country. He was brutally tortured by the Japanese in the late 19th century. He was abused by Koreans who didn't like his ideas of nationhood and independence. He eventually comes to the United States, gets a couple of graduate degrees. He meets President Woodrow Wilson. He raises money out in California and Hawaii to help the cause of Korean independence prior to World War II. And then in 1945, Korea is liberated, and Syngman Rhee basically says, "Okay, I'm ready to go home and take over." And the United States is, "Nah, we're not too sure about that. If you're really the guy that we want." But it was his credentials as a nationalist were impeccable. Besides the fact that he lived overseas, so he didn't live in Korea under Japanese occupation, but he was a household name. Everybody knew who Syngman Rhee was. So in 1948, he's kind of the father of the country. He's elected president. But curiously enough, the Republic of Korea, the ROC, as I say, their constitution, the president was elected by the Assembly, the National Assembly. So it's as if the House of Representatives voted for who the president would be. So he's elected in 1948. In 1950 are the midterm elections, and a lot of his allies in the National Assembly get voted out. And this is before the war begins. This is May of 1950. So you get a lot of independent legislators who don't really like Syngman Rhee's brand of politics, which run towards the authoritarian side. 2 years later, 1952, his 4-year term is up. Time for him to be reelected. Well, Syngman Rhee's not a fool, and he realizes that if the National Assembly is going to elect the president, he's not going to get reelected. So he comes up with a great idea. We're going to change the Constitution to allow the president to be elected by direct vote by the people of South Korea. That's matter. The National Assembly refuses to entertain the idea to change the Constitution. So Syngman Rhee says, "Okay, fine, you're all under arrest." So Syngman Rhee gets he gets what the ambassador to Korea, John Mucho, called the goon squads to go in and arrest these recalcitrant assemblymen who are opposed to Syngman Rhee. And if they can't arrest them, they beat them up. They beat up their supporters. And this is in the city of Pusan. Pusan is the wartime seat of government for the South Koreans. Pusan is also the main port of where all the supplies are going in, right? So the last thing the Americans want is Pusan, on fire like a dumpster. So it gets to this point where the Americans are really in a bind. Do we support this authoritarian figure who is perpetrating a coup by throwing in jail all of the National Assembly who won't change the Constitution the way he wants it changed, while at the same time we're claiming that we're preserving democracy and liberal government in South Korea with all of our allies, right? So General Mark Clark devises this plan called Eveready. That the premise of the plan was, if it looks like Sigmund Rhee is going to go through with this, extra constitutional process to make himself president again, we would find a way. The Americans would find a way to get Sigmund Rhee out of town, get him up to Seoul, tell him that General Ridgway wants to meet him or whatever, get him out of Busan. Then we would use loyal Korean Army units to kind of converge on Busan and suppress, these youth groups and the goon squads that John Mucho was talking about, and arrest all of Sigmund Rhee's guys. And then once that was done in Seoul, Van Fleet or Ridgway or whoever it was would basically tell Sigmund Rhee, oh, by the way, all your guys have been arrested and you need to abdicate. You need to resign and appoint somebody else to be president. This plan did not have a lot of support from Clark's subordinates, especially General Van Fleet. Van Fleet was very much pro-Korean and had spent a lot of time conditioning Korean soldiers to not be involved in politics. So the last thing Van Fleet wants to do is tell his Korean guys, hey, I need you to take over the government. Even though we've been talking about professionalism and, nonpartisan and being apolitical. Fortunately, after a lot of back and forth and, Truman gets involved and such, President Rhee agrees that, okay, we'll find a way. And miraculously, the National Assembly changes the Constitution, and President Rhee stands for a direct vote, and he wins something like 96% or something like that, an insanely large margin, and the crisis is over, and everybody's happy. But Plan Eveready stays on the books because in 1953 it looks like we might really have to do it, because President Rhee is very much against signing an armistice, and we come pretty close to removing him from the political scene so we can get an armistice.
What was was there a question that was particularly difficult for you to get an answer for that you're still wondering about, or maybe you did figure out the answer but it took a while?
Kind of I think it kind of revolves around the what if of, President Truman decides not to run for re-election in 1952. In January of 52, his approval rating is it's like 22%. It's moribund, and he decides to step aside and he promotes a gentleman named Adlai Stevenson to run for the Democrat Party. He had approached Dwight Eisenhower because Eisenhower was fairly well known as being a nonpartisan figure. So he approaches Eisenhower, who's president of Columbia University at the time, and tries to recruit him to run as a Democrat. And Eisenhower shrewdly turns him down. But Eisenhower doesn't tell the full story, which is, and I don't know how much of this is really true and how much is really justification, but Ike's view was it's probably time that another political party take the lead of the American government. And that's one of the reasons why Eisenhower accepts the Republican nomination. He also wanted to keep it out of the hands of what was still a fairly hard core of isolationists, because Eisenhower does recognize that, we need allies, we need NATO, we can't take on the Soviets by ourselves. Mm-hmm. So he runs for president and runs a very shrewd campaign. It's called, its shorthand is KC squared, Korea, Communism, and Corruption, which might have been like dirty pool, because Eisenhower is kind of one of those guys who he kind of knows where all the bodies are buried, because he's been involved, at the highest reaches of the military side of the government for so long. Mm-hmm. But he runs on this sense of, it's time for a change, and Korea is not going so well. Well, this really disturbs Truman, obviously, but Dean Acheson is very concerned that Eisenhower either will articulate before the election a different policy when it comes to the repatriation of POWs, or people will suspect that he will articulate a different policy, in which case the communists might just be encouraged to kind of wait it out and see what happens. Fortunately, Eisenhower assures Acheson, no, well, I intend to follow the president's policy. But that's not, it's not a sure thing. People are still kind of wondering. In late October, Eisenhower gives a speech, I think it's in Michigan, and he promises, if I'm elected, I will go to Korea. Everyone's cheering. Great. What they heard was, if I'm elected, I will solve the Korean problem. But that's not what he said. He said, I will go to Korea. And so he gets elected, and sure enough, early December, he gets on a plane, flies to Korea. So here's kind of the what if. When he gets to Korea, Mark Clark and James Van Fleet, who had both worked for Eisenhower during World War II, Van Fleet and Eisenhower were classmates at West Point. They knew each other very well. And Mark Clark had a plan. It was called Operations Plan 852, or Op Plan 8-52. That was kind of this, hey, let's try to win the war. All this negotiation stuff and interdiction and limited attack, it's not working. Let's really put the pain on the communists, and we can do it, right? Because Eisenhower, if anyone can do it, he can do it. And so they want to pitch this plan to Eisenhower, who, like I said, Eisenhower's a shrewd man. He knew that this was coming. And the plan is it's horrible. I call it worse than a MacArthur do-over, because it does not take into account at all the strategic and policy issues that have really framed the Korean War for the previous 3 years, 2.5 years. You just can't act like they're not there, and and just bowl on through and think you're going to win the war. So it's a horrible plan. It looks good for military men, because we're going to get more troops, more planes. We don't need atomic bombs, but maybe if we had 500 stashed away on Guam, that might not be a bad idea. Well, yeah, because as soon as you try to attack to the Yalu River, the hordes of China are going to come at you, so you better be able to fight them off. So Eisenhower very astutely avoids having that conversation with Clark and Van Fleet. Instead, he gets a briefing with a Korean general called Pak Sun-yup. And Pak Sun-yup he's the Americans' favorite Korean. He speaks marvelous English. He served in not the Japanese army, but kind of the Japanese surrogate army in Manchuria during the war, fighting communist guerrillas. So he understands Chinese too. And he just kind of had this natural sense of professionalism and competence. So he's very, very much trusted by the Americans. He's the chief of staff of the Korean Army, and he gets a couple hours with Eisenhower and basically explains to Eisenhower, look, we appreciate everything the United States has done for us, but we recognize that what it costs you to mobilize, train, and deploy a soldier for 1 year, I can, meaning the Koreans, I can recruit, train, and maintain in the field indefinitely 3 Koreans. So in other words, let us Koreans fight this war. Okay, you give us the money and kind of the political coverage to do so. This is a very attractive proposition to Eisenhower. He does want to end the war, but no one has really told him how to do it, right? Until Pak Sun-yeol tells him how to do it. So when Eisenhower goes back to the United States and then eventually is inaugurated, you see the American strategy shift from this combat operations, we're going to give the enemy a bloody nose, to we're going to make the ROC Army, the Korean Army, bigger and better and meaner. And this process had been going on already since the summer of 1951. And this is the subject of my first book, is how the Americans raised and trained this army. But it's not really until Eisenhower gets into office that we're going to open up the spigot and we're going to provide the money to support a much larger Korean army. So what you end up seeing in January of '53, and this is kind of beyond the scope of Korean Showdown, but it would be like the third book, if I was doing the last part of the war. The Korean army occupies over 60% of the front line, conducts over 60% of the patrols and attacks, is inflicting somewhere around 70% of all enemy casualties that we can assess on the ground, not including artillery and air power, and is suffering over 50% of all the casualties. So in other words, they're fighting the war. Great. It sounds like we can now the Americans can start pulling back, and I believe that this really has a profound effect on the communists, who they think that they're tying up the Americans, in this backwater conflict in Korea. But as the Koreans are becoming more effective and are doing more of the fighting, the math doesn't add up anymore. It's not, for the Chinese, it's not worth it to kill a Korean. It's worth it if they can kill an American.
Yeah, interesting.
So I guess that unanswered question is, what if Eisenhower had said to Clark, okay, let's do it. Let's try moving to the Yalu again. And I think that would have been strategically, very tragic.
So apart from filling the historical gaps, what do you hope the book will do for readers?
I hope that the reader takes away, number one, a very simple thought, and that is policy matters. And so when we talk about military operations, this is especially today, military strategy, tactics, operations, that's what gets everyone real excited to discuss and to debate. But at the end of the day, if the policy is not clear, then your strategy is going to be problematic. And if you have an unclear policy and or a problematic strategy, operations and tactics are not going to produce the effect that you want to produce. And so for the Americans in Korea, it takes a long time to get to that final policy of we called it voluntary repatriation. It's February 1952. The decision to negotiate a settlement is arrived at in Washington around January of '51. So from January of '51 to February of '52, it's 13 months. It takes the American government to figure out, what are we fighting for? And if it had been clear in June or July of '51 that this was going to be the stance that we were going to take, the progress of negotiations would have been much different. Because by the time you get to February of '52, we've already decided on a boundary, a demarcation line. So any attack that we make beyond that line, we're going to have to give that land back. So if you've already decided that the enemy has a sanctuary, how how do you use military means to kind of raise the bar. And I think that's really the lesson. And when you look at our recent history in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, if you're struggling to understand the strategy and the operations, ask yourself, do you understand the policy? And if the policy is unclear, then that probably is the source of frustration.
Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
No, it just took time. What I tell anyone who will listen is if you spend an hour a day, you will finish your book. You got to have that time to do so. I've been very fortunate in working with the University of Alabama Press. They've published both of my books. And I think the hardest part was probably on their end to find disinterested reviewers. Could read the manuscript and provide substantive feedback. And I've been very fortunate that for both books they were able to find 4 different Korean War scholars with the knowledge base, with enough of a knowledge base, because not necessarily exactly what I was talking about, but enough knowledge base to let me know where I might have gotten my facts wrong. I might have extended my interpretation of the facts a little bit too far, in which case my conclusions are not necessarily justified, or that there might be other sources that I need to consult.
What's your next writing project, or your current one?
So I guess I like peninsulas that have a lot of mountains on it, because I've now turned to Italy, principally the 1944 campaign, Allied campaign against Anzio Beach and Cassino. And so far, I like this. I like this idea because it's not another D-Day book. It's not another Market Garden book. All that stuff's been written. The Italian campaign was a sideshow. Well, for the Americans, it was a sideshow. For Great Britain, it was like the main event. But for the Americans, it was a sideshow. And so historians have tended to treat it as a sideshow. And so there's relatively less that's been written about it. It's also very interesting because Anzio is an amphibious operation. Cassino is a frontal attack against a mountain fortress. And most historical studies talk about one or the other. There's books about Cassino, there's books about Anzio. These books will of necessity make reference to the other battle, but nobody has really integrated that narrative. From the German standpoint, it was one battle. It was an integrated battle from the very beginning. So what I'm trying to look at is looking at both battles in a single campaign, and the subtitle to the book is going to be called "A Failure of Allied Command." Italy is the theater itself. Italy is commanded by a British officer named Harold Alexander, and his principal subordinate is, wait for it, General Mark Clark, who goes on to Korea. And General Mark Clark has not commanded at the Army, the Corps, the division, or the regimental levels ever. He briefly commanded a battalion in France in World War I and was wounded on practically his first day of operations. So his experience base is very low, and he's over subordinates, American subordinates, who in some cases are many years his senior, and who, for example, taught him at the War College. He was the student, and now he's the Army commander. General Clark also doesn't really like Englishmen all that much, and part of his army is a corps, the 10th Corps, which is all British. And so my intent behind the book was I thought I was going to rehabilitate Clark's image, because there's a lot of controversy. The 36th Infantry Division, Texas National Guard, pretty much gets itself wiped out at the Rapido River. Clark ordered that attack. The bombing of the monastery at Monte Cassino, Clark ordered that attack. So there's some stink on him, but I thought, based on what he did in Korea, I said, okay, there's got to be more to the story.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out the failure of Allied command is that you had the British at the top, Alexander, you have the American in the middle, Mark Clark, and then at Anzio, you have an American Corps commander who has both American and British divisions working for him. And unfortunately, the Americans and the British were two people separated by a common language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's very hard, right, to do that. And like I said, Mark Clark is very distrustful of the British. And in his own diaries, he's constantly worried that somehow the British are going to cheat him out of the honor of capturing Rome. That was very important to him, and for understandable reasons. President Roosevelt told him, "I want you to capture Rome." Okay, Roger, sir, I got it. I'll capture Rome. And so there comes a point, the critical point of the battle. Clark, in my professional view, makes a very bad decision, and that bad decision undermines the Allied plan. Clark captures Rome, but it was at great expense to what could have been possible. So that's kind of the crux there is, why did that operation not live up to its potential that it could have?
So is there anywhere people can find you on the web to follow your thoughts, social media or website?
So remember I told you I'm a military intelligence officer.
Yeah.
So my online presence is actually quite low, which unfortunate, but I guess that's just kind of how I grew up.
So I guess people can go to the University of Alabama Press website to get information on your books.
Yeah, and if they did Google my name, Bryan Gibby, Bryan spelled with a Y. There's two of us. There's one in Idaho who's a doctor, and then there's the colonel who's at West Point. But you can see, and that's also a good plug for the West Point Department of History. Much of the history we teach was made by people we taught, and that's something that we're very proud of. And we teach, of course, military history, but we also do American history and international regional studies. Because we believe it's very important that every soldier who wears the name tag United States Army, they got to know something about the country that they're serving and the soldiers that they're going to lead. And it's been a long time since we fought a war in North America, and I hope to keep it that way. So you need to know something about the world, the world around you. And so we do invest considerable resources teaching cadets that other people think differently, and especially in, say, for example, in the Middle East, they think about war differently than we do. We think about war is bad, peace is good. There's peace, there's war. That's not necessarily how the rest of the world thinks about the continuum of conflict.
Interesting. Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
I appreciate the opportunity here to talk about the book. I think strategy is an art. It's kind of like a dark art. It's not very well understood. I'm certainly no expert at it, but as I did my research, I realized that there was this gap of senior military officials being able to have a dialogue with the political masters, with the president, and that dialogue is it's crucial. FDR never went anywhere without either George Marshall, Admiral King, or Admiral Bill Leahy. He had there was some military uniformed person that he could bounce ideas off of. He could listen to them. he didn't necessarily take their advice, but he had to imbibe that and then make his own political decision. That we seem to kind of lost that, and I'm not sure if it was a deliberate choice or the military profession kind of went this way of this is what soldiers do, this is what politicians do, and never the twain shall meet. Obviously, our tradition of being nonpartisan and apolitical is vitally important. But at the end of the day, if the policy is unclear, and it's the obligation of a professional military officer to help the political leaders, maybe not formulate the policy, but be able to articulate that policy, so it can be translated into a reasonable and coherent strategy. And at the same time, from Vietnam, there was this criticism of, politicians getting involved in strategy. Well, I hope so. Secretary Atchison, he needed to be in on those discussions because military actions that you take have political consequences. And if there's not somebody in the room who can talk to those consequences, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And the last point I'll make relative to that is in the Korean context, when the negotiations got together, the United States appointed five members. Okay? 4 of them were American and 1 was Korean. Every one of them was a combat commander. The communists also put up 5 individuals. None of them were combat commanders. They were military, but every one of them was intelligence, political, or propaganda officers. So from the very beginning, the communists knew that this was a political fight to negotiate an armistice settlement. The Americans thought they were in a military fight. Right? Wow. And Ridgway even recognized that. And after about a month, he cables back to Washington and says, please send me a political guy. Send me somebody from the State Department. And Washington turned him down because Washington made a policy decision not to engage the communists over political issues during the armistice negotiations.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'd encourage people to read this book and learn more about these very important topics, I think.
Thank you. I agree.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Chris, it was my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this video version of Military History Inside Out. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Thank you for watching.